What up, Wizards? It's Deb from the place we like it of Magic, and it is Crimson Vow spoiler season, baby. And Wizards kicked it off with some pretty juicy stuff today. So let's go ahead and get into it. As soon as Chicken calms down, are you all right over there? Cutie pie. As usual, let's start building tension and mounting suspense by talking about some cards that are kind of limited playable, but they have the upside of teaching us some of the new mechanics from this set. Let's start by looking at a couple of creatures with the training ability. Here's Apprentice Sharpshooter and Griff Rider. Apprentice Sharpshooter is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 1/4 human archer with reach and training. Whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Griff Rider is also a 3 mana creature. This one 2 and a white for a 2/1 human knight with flying and training as well. So this is the ability that Mark Rosewater was talking about, is a mirror of another ability, or at least it appears that way. This looks to be a mirror of the mentor ability. Now both of these dudes look reasonably easy to buff once you get things going, especially Apprentice Sharpshooter because it's just got the 1 power. Doesn't take much to train this up, but often I don't know how much you're going to be wanting to attack with your giant butted reach guy. I mean, maybe, right? Because once this gets like 1 counter, it has 5 toughness, it can block all day for the rest of the game, and it can even kill like 2 toughness flyers. So maybe you do want a counter or 2 on this, but I like Griff Rider even more. It's a Windrake. We like Windrakes in Limited, but this is a Windrake that's pretty easy to get to like 3 or 4 power, and that's pretty good for the investment that you made. Just 3 mana, so I like this thing a lot in like aggressive Limited decks. But let's take a look at another lower rarity card that introduces a new mechanic, and this one I kind of like. This is Gluttonous Guest. It's a great name. A sucker for alliteration, but this is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 1/4 vampire, and when it ETBs, you get a blood token. Now that is an artifact with 1 tap, discard a card, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. Whenever you sacrifice a blood token, you gain 1 life. So there are some things I like about this. Ultimately, though, I don't think it's going to be as playable at the same mana cost in Standard as a card like Skullport Merchant, which is probably better. But this could be a key player, like a role-playing thing, in certain decks that care about blood tokens. And we're going to look at a couple of cards today that care about blood tokens and I think are actually quite good. In some ways better than they appear. So I think the blood tokens deck is probably cool, and I like the incremental life gain. I especially like this in combination with stuff that triggers when you gain life, and we got a few of those things in Standard. So altogether, there's probably some cool things you can do with this, and blood tokens in general are pretty awesome. I mean, they're kind of half of a clue. You know, they cost half as much of a clue as a clue to pop. Just the 1 mana, but you have to also discard a card, which often will probably suck in practice, but in theory, there's a lot of ways to make that an upside. You reanimate the creature, you disturb the creature, you flash back the card you discarded. There's a lot of ways to turn that into an upside. So blood tokens decks could be really cool, and I like the idea of blood tokens in general, but this particular card does not necessarily get the Wi-Fi password. Do you get it? Because guessed, it was a terrible joke, and I apologize. But let's get reintroduced to an older mechanic through a lower rarity card that I actually like a little bit. This is Rot-Tide Gargantua RTG. It's 5 mana, 3 and 2 black for a 5/4 zombie kraken, like the creature types. We knew a zombie kraken was coming in this set. I just didn't expect it to be a common. But this has Exploit, which we last saw in Khan's block, which doesn't feel like that long ago, but it actually kind of was. Now, in case you haven't seen Exploit before, you just forgot about it. It's when this creature enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature. When Rot-Tide Gargantua exploits a creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So it's one of these. You know, usually these are 3 mana. It comes into play, everybody sacrifices a thing. But instead, this is 5 mana, and it's huge. It's not just like a 3/1 like we normally see on these guys. And I kind of like it in Limited because it's a giant body that also makes your opponent sack a creature. But let's get talking about yet another new mechanic in this set. Although it's not new, it's just the way they're doing it is new. You'll see what I mean. Here's Drogskull Infantry here. This is just 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 2/2 Spirit Soldier with Disturb, 3 and a white. What's the Disturb creature side of it too? Hold on. The other side of it is Drogskull Armaments, which is an enchantment. It's an aura that enchants a creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2. If Armaments would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, so it still has that text on it. This is not a very impressive card, obviously, but all of the Disturb cards that we've seen so far in this set, and very likely every Disturb card in the set, is an enchantment on its back half. And that's cool. It's kind of like a version of Haunt from Dissension, I think. Dissension. But it's also kind of like Bestow somewhat, a little bit. So, I don't know. It's got some similarities to some other abilities, but I think this is actually a really cool ability, especially considering that a lot of like Enchantress decks, right, they run this line where they can't play too many creatures because they need to play enchantments. They can't play too many enchantments because they need to play creatures. And like Bestow helped solve that problem a little bit. And I think that this ability does too, to where your Enchantress deck can play more creatures, play more threats to put enchantments on. So I don't know. I think this is a really, really cool idea. And it also lessens the sting of losing an enchantment. You don't get blown out as much because at least you got a creature on the front half of it that your opponent had to deal with somehow. Right, so when you bring it back to the enchantment, even if you lose the creature it's enchanted to, you lose the enchantment forever, at least you got other value out of playing your aura, aside from just being an aura. You don't feel completely blown out in those situations. So I really like this design space, and I can't wait to see what they do more with it. Now, there was some other random lower rarity stuff to get to before we get to the rares and mythics and stuff today, like Weary Prisoner, which isn't really anything special, just a 4-mana 2/6 with Defender with Daybound. And when it becomes Night, it's a 6/6, and it can attack. It has to attack, as a matter of fact. Every single combat. It's a creature, a card that exists. We also saw Massive Might, which is just 1 green mana for an instant. Creature gets +2/+2 and gains trample till end of turn. I actually really like this. I don't think it's better than Snakeskin Veil in Standard, but punching through with trample is really important. And in Limited, I think this is probably going to be a pretty good combat trick, whether you're trying to like surprise an opponent and in the game, or just deal more damage than they thought, or, you know, grow a creature that your opponent thought they were going to trade with, or maybe they thought they were going to keep their guy, you're going to lose your guy on that block. Cards like this are typically very good in Limited, but the addition of trample is always better than you think it is. So I like this card a good bit, but there's also some very, very good lower rarity stuff left to talk about, like Wedding Invitation. This is just 2 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. It's one of these, but you can also tap it and sack it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. There's additional gravy, though. If it's a vampire, it gains lifelink till end of turn. Somebody in my chat pointed out Westgate Regent, and I just like, that's amazing. Get your Westgate Regent through, grow it to be huge, or maybe it already is huge. You get it through unblocked. You gain a bunch of lifelink. Oh, it's so good. That's a pretty good use for Westgate Regent, but I just like this in general. I like these 2 mana artifacts they've been printing over the last few years that draw a card when they ETB and then do something else. And this is no exception. I think this is one of the stronger ones that we've seen this entire time. Seriously, like in the late game, getting a creature through unblocked, guaranteed, is like really hot. So I'm actually a huge fan of this card. But now we're getting into some like really good uncommons. So allow me to introduce you to Geistlight Snare, baby. This is 3 mana, 2 and a blue for an instant that costs 1 less to cast if you control a spirit. It also costs 1 less to cast if you control an enchantment. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, kid. That's really good. That's so good. If you have 1 spirit or 1 enchantment, you have mana leak, and that's so good. Especially considering we have some 1-drop spirits in Standard that are really playable. We have Usher of the Fallen, we have Ascendant Spirit, and this is online on turn 2 if you play either of those 1-drops. And that's pretty hot. Like even on like turn 5, if you have this up for 2 mana, it's good. And it's possible to have it up for 1 mana. Like, that's so good. It's like a Mystical Dispute that you can always cast for 1 mana. Depending on the board state at least. Like even if it costs 3 mana, if Mystical Dispute taught us anything, even if it costs 3 mana, especially on the play, it's still like a playable counterspell. Like especially in a land of Alrund's Epiphanies and like really expensive cards, even if you have to pay full price for this, it's going to be fine some of the time. But if you get that 1 mana discount, it is mana leak, and that is sexy. But if you obviously it can only cost you 1 mana too. If you have both a spirit and an enchantment, then like it is just a super sick, super cheap counterspell. And I can see like maybe like even spirit party decks to try to work in some number of this and concerted defense to have all the 1 mana counters. Like, God, it could work. It could work and be like super tight. So I like this card, and I think that it adds a lot to the spirits deck. But my favorite uncommon of the day, and I'm actually stoked to see, I did a Twitter post, like, what's your favorite card of the day? And I'm stoked to see that this is a lot of people's favorite card of the entire day, like rare, mythic, uncommon, whatever. But I really, really like Fell Stinger, like a lot. I talked myself into this on stream, and like, I think I talked a bunch of other people into it too. But Fell Stinger is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 3/2 zombie scorpion with Death Touch and Exploit. When this creature enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature. When Stinger exploits a creature, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. All right, first of all, my favorite thing I've heard about with this card so far, somebody replied to me on Twitter and said, like, use this with Olerin, and like, unless you want to say Allurin. People pronounce this card all kinds of ways, but yeah, actually it should be over here, right? I'm not actually sure where I'm putting cards, but yeah, Allurin is a pretty sick thing to use this with in older formats, but I honestly think that in Standard this could be pretty good. I was comparing it to Morbid Opportunist on stream, and think about this, right? Like, it's like a Morbid Opportunist, but you get the value up front. It's like 2 turns of Morbid Opportunist value right up front, and that's really good. It's kind of like a Phyrexian Rager, but you draw more. You lose more life, who cares? But you draw more. And by the way, you don't have to lose life. You can point this at your opponent. Like, if they're at 2 or something, you can win games with this. Or maybe you have like a teleportation circle out and you know that you're going to hit them for 4 that turn with the Scorpion. Like, there's ways you can just straight up win games with this thing, especially if you have like multiple copies in your hand. Maybe one copy draws into another, and then like that one you use to shoot your opponent. I don't know. There's lots of cool ways to use this that I just really like. This card has, earlier I said this card rows. ROWS, because it has a lot of ores. Probably one of the worst jokes I've ever told on camera, but it has a lot of ores. This can just be a 3-mana 3/2 Death Touch, or it can be a 3-mana 3/2 Death Touch that also lets you sacrifice your Eye Twitch or your Shambling Gas. And if you sacrifice an Eye Twitch, you get 3 cards off of this. If you sacrifice a Shambling Gas, you get, a mana back, or you get to kill a guy. Like, that's so sick. Or it can just sacrifice itself, because it doesn't say sacrifice another creature. Exploit, you can sacrifice itself. So yeah, it's in play. You can sack it and just draw 2 cards if you'd rather do that. It doesn't have to be a body, but sometimes it's a body with Death Touch that also draws 2 cards. It feels like a removal spell. That's another ore that it is. Like, you play it for 3 mana, you draw 2. Now you have a 3 mana or 3 power Death Touch guy. It's just sitting there gumming up the board. It'll block anything on the ground and kill it. Like, I don't know. It's like a removal spell that draws you 2 cards. And in exchange for that, you have to, sacrifice a little dude that you'll usually get upside by sacrificing anyway. And like, in an Aristocrats deck, it's a sacrifice outlet and another creature on the battlefield that draws you into more Aristocrat stuff. It's just, I don't know, guys. I think this is a really, really slick card that's actually a lot better than it looks. I think it looks like a random uncommon, but turns out I think there's probably a lot of there with this thing. All right, so now let's hit the rares and mythics, some of which I won't like as much as the card I just talked about, but I actually do like a lot of today's selection. But first I have to tell you about the cycle of duels that got completed today. It's the slow lands, the things that they come into play untapped if you control 2 or more other lands. We got all of them. We actually did. I'm so happy. We actually got these. I know a lot of people were telling me in the comments to another video I just recently did. They're like, they're probably not going to print these right now, but God, they did. And I'm super happy about that. And you should be too. We got these. That's great. It's really good. That's all I really have to say about that. That'll help out a whole lot of decks. And these might be some of the most impactful and important cards in the entire set, but that's all you can really say. Let's move on to Voldaren Estate, another land, but this one I have a little bit more to say about. This is just a land that taps. It's not legendary either, by the way, but it taps for a colorless, or you can tap it and pay a life to add a mana of any color, but you can only cast vampire spells with that mana. You can also pay 5 and tap it to make a blood token, but this ability costs 1 less to activate for each vampire you control. That's actually pretty good. I would say. I was lamenting that the vampire deck was just going to have Haunted Ridge, because Haunted Ridge is a good card in like the Grixis control decks and stuff like that. Aggro decks don't typically love these cards, right? I mean, they're good and you play them in your aggro deck, but sometimes it can get a little awkward when you have the draws that are just like 2 Haunted Ridges. They're your only lands. You can't play your 1-drop. It just kind of sucks. But like, this makes it a lot easier to actually play black-red or even 3-color vampires, depending, and make it work. So I'm actually super jacked about this card. And the blood token thing is cool too, like you can do it at instant speed. It doesn't say you have to do it as a sorcery. So like, end of your opponent's turn, or like in response to a wrath while you still have a bunch of vampires on the field, you can activate this and get a blood token. Like, you can get a blood token every turn. Sometimes if you have enough vampires out, seems a little win more, but if you have enough vampires out, you can just tap this for a blood token, which is a pretty slick deal. So I like this card an awful lot. It sort of helps the vampires decks go long, but also gives them a land that allows them to just, fix their mana in the early game too. So there's a lot of cool things about this card. Oh, and by the way, also, Thalia got reprinted. While we're talking about cool stuff, Thalia's here, and it's just Thalia. Anybody that had their money on, this is what Mark Rosewater was talking about when he said like a powerful popular creature is going to get reprinted. Congratulations. I did not expect this. I thought it was definitely going to be something else, but for all we know, there might be another. I don't expect it'll be Snapcaster or anything, but we got Thalia, and I think we can all be happy about that, maybe. I mean, this is pretty good against Alrund's Epiphany. Although, there's still like Fading Hope, Frostbite, and Dragon's Fire, but they'll all cost a mana more, which is kind of a pain in the butt. There's still like Elite Spellbinder and Redain to go with this, so that's pretty saucy. You play Thalia turn 2, and you go like Elite Spellbinder or Redain on turn 3, and it's just going to cost them 1 million mana to play like anything. So I don't know. Really happy that we have Thalia. Never thought they'd pull the trigger on this, but we actually got our girl back, and it's her. It's just the same card, and that's great. Also, she's not a vampire. A lot of people were afraid that she would be a vampire. She's not. That's good. But moving on to Sigarda's Summons. This is 6 mana, 4 and 2 white for an enchantment. Creatures you control get with +1/+1 counters on them, have base power and toughness 4/4, have flying, and are angels in addition to their other types. So this is probably win more in most situations. I mean, Luminarch Aspirant exists. It's a good Magic card, but I think most of the decks running Luminarch Aspirant, this is way too expensive for in most cases. But I will say this is a pretty good finisher in a tokens deck, especially a tokens deck that has the ability to put +1/+1 counters on things, which shouldn't be too hard. There's multiple ways of doing it in Standard. So, I'm sure that there's a fun combo deck out there, and this might even be fun with like Catilda, for instance, which can put +1/+1 counters on things, and you can tap those things to help you play this in the first place. And the turn you play this, it has some pretty good value, right? Anything that's still untapped, you can swing for at least 5 with. So that's pretty good. I think this could be a cool finisher in just the right kind of deck, but for this mana cost and the fact that you need to have a stacked board full of creatures to make it work in the first place, it's probably just a piece of jank, but it is a glorious piece of jank and I love it. So now let's look at Demonic Bargain, an interesting card. This is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a sorcery. Exile the top 13 cards of your library. It won't be the last time you see that number today, by the way. Then search your library for a card. Put that card into your hand, shuffle your library. So this reminds me of Demonic Consultation just a little bit, which was just 1 mana, but it had you mill 6 cards, exile 6 cards off the top of your library, and then start from there. This is twice as many cards and 3 times the mana cost, which is pretty nuts, but we're playing Standard Magic. It's not Ice Age anymore, so we can't have a card anywhere near as powerful as Consultation, because believe me, Consultation was a ridiculously powerful card, but this is still kind of fine. I mean, hopefully you're not looking for a 1-of, and then you mill that. That would suck. That's the fail case on the card, and it's entirely likely. But in the right kind of toolboxy or just control deck or something like that, I could see this, especially in a 3 to 5 color control deck that, could easily cast this card much more easily than some other tutors it has access to. So, it's easier to cast this than a Diabolic Tutor, and I think that might matter. So the fact that there's not a whole lot of color requirements to cast the card, the fact that it's only 3 mana, and I get to say that by standards nowadays, 3 mana is not much for this kind of tutor. It's not bad. Hopefully you don't cast it against Mill, because then you're probably dead. They're just happy that you kind of Tasha'd yourself in that situation. But still, I think that this is actually kind of a solid card in some situations, but it probably still won't see that much play. End of the day. All right, interesting card before we start getting into some really powerful stuff. Here's Wedding Announcement. This is an enchantment that costs 2 and a white to cast. At the beginning of your end step, put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. If you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn, draw a card. If you didn't, otherwise, create a 1/1 white human creature token. Then, if Wedding Announcement has 3 or more counters on it, you transform it. The transform half of it is creatures you control get +1/+1. So this is interesting. It kind of reminds me of a Bitter Blossom or something like that, but it's only ever going to give you 3 creatures before it flips over. But then all those guys are 2/2s, plus all your other guys get +1/+1. It's not a terrible Anthem effect, but there's multiple issues. I mean, Mono White already has all these awesome 3-drops that it wants to play, and I'm not really sure this fits on the curve. if this did fit on the curve, I think it'd be better if it was just a sparring regimen or something. But no, no, instead it's this. And the draw here is that sometimes it'll draw you cards in mono white, and that's a thing you super totally want. And then other times it's going to make dudes for you, which is also a thing you want. I think it's interesting how many different decks this could go in. Like, it could go in mono white, it could go in an aggro deck possibly, but it could also go in a control deck. One that's like never going to attack with 2 dudes, right? So it's always going to get a creature to block with every single turn. And then later in the game when it flips over, you're okay with that because it might make your finisher a little bit bigger or your creature lands a little bit bigger. So I don't know, the transformed half of this could matter even in a control deck, but mostly this looks like a way to make low to the ground creature decks draw cards at the top of their curve while also paying off in creatures sometimes and an eventual Anthem effect. But it's going to be like turn 6 or 7 before you really get the Anthem effect on it. And by then you've had your face epiphanied off. You probably want to win the game before the Anthem effect even comes into effect at all on this card. So I'm just not sure that it's not like slightly too awkward, but in terms of like mono white card draw, it's really good in that capacity, so it might be good enough to see really sparing play. Now, all that said, in Commander, I think this is a very cool card. Let's look at another tutor, though. Here's Dig Up. This is just 1 green mana for a sorcery with a new ability, Cleave, and you cast it for its cleave cost for 1, 2 black, and a green. Now, if you cast it for its cleave cost, you remove the words in square brackets, which seems like an unset ability to me, too. But it's cool. It's a cool ability. Now, if you just cast it for a green, you get search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So you get a lay of the land. Now, if you cast it for the cleave cost, you get search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So that's really interesting design. I do kind of like this, although it's a bit weird in some ways, but I still kind of like this, and I especially like the design space of this. There's probably a lot of cool ways they can explore it. But all things considered, I do like this card in a Sultai control deck or something like that. In the early game, this will help you fix your mana. It'll help you hit your 3rd or 4th land drop, and that's actually really important some of the time. Depends on how strong your hand is. Maybe you want your land drop, maybe you want to hold it for a card you don't already have yet, or a card you know you're going to need, like a sweeper, for instance. So that there's all kinds of ways to use this in a control deck. And, if you don't need to hit your land drops, then later on, again, you just go get like your finisher, your combo piece, your win condition, your sweeper, removal spell, whatever. Like, there's all kinds of ways to use this card, and I really don't think that we should downplay the sort of versatility on a card like this. I think this is actually way better than it looked to probably 35% of my chat. It was like, it's not good. I think this card is quite good. Now, it's probably not good enough to see all the play in the world, but good enough to see some play. I would not be surprised to see this show up as a 1 or 2 of in certain decks. But moving on to Dominating Vampire. This is 1 and 2 red for a 3/3 vamp. And when it ETBs, gain control of target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of vampires you control till end of turn. Untap that creature, gains haste till end of turn. So there's a couple of cool things you can do with this that I didn't even mention on stream. Like, if you don't have any other vampires at all, this can steal 1-drops, but more importantly, it steals tokens. This can steal a Wrenn and 7 token, even if you have 0 other vampires on the battlefield, which I think is really sweet. Like, that's going to matter a good bit. And with all these tokens from like Esca's Chariot rolling around, like this could seriously matter. So I like that about it. As a 3-drop, it's just a 3-mana 3/3, which is not going to be very good in a lot of situations, as we've been taught the last few years. But still, when you do steal a creature with this, if you're able to curve out 1-drop, 2-drop this, steal their 2 or 3-drop, then you probably went a long way towards winning the game against like mono white. So this will help you win those matchups, win the tempo race and all that. If you have a way to sacrifice the creature, sucks you can't sacrifice it to Pit Fighter, it has to be a vampire, but still. If you can find a way to sacrifice the creature that you stole, then it's even better. So there's this card actually, I think, may end up being an instrumental card in vampires at some point, but in an All Runs Epiphany meta, I'm a little bit worried that there's not going to be a good enough creature to steal with this, so that you're not going to have like the 5 vampires required to steal a Goldspan Dragon or anything. So I'm not actually super sure how good the card is in today's meta, but if we move past All Runs Epiphany, whatever it takes to do that, then then it's possible this card sees a lot more main deck play, but at the very least, if Red-Black Vampires is a real deck, this is an obvious sideboard choice. Now up next, now we're getting into the heavy hitters. This is Savior of Ollenbock. This is 3 mana, 1 and 2 white for a 1/2 human soldier with training. Now obviously, when this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, you put a +1/+1 counter on this dude. When Savior of Ollenbock trains, exile up to 1 other target creature from the battlefield or a creature card from a graveyard. When Ollenbock leaves the battlefield, you put the exiled cards onto the battlefield under their owner's control. And so this can do 2 things. It can either snatch your opponent's creatures from off the battlefield, which is pretty good, or it can reanimate your own dudes eventually, right? Like you grab one of your dudes out of the graveyard, put it up under Savior, and then when Savior dies, whether it dies in combat or to a removal spell or to a sacrifice effect, then your dudes just pop out from under it, which is pretty cool in a lot of ways. I like how this interacts with a lot of the 3-drops that Mono White has access to, but I don't like that it is also a 3-drop. I mean, I've already talked about this like multiple times, but there's at least 5 playable 3-drops in Mono White already that I can name off the top of my head that aren't too hard to think of. So I don't really know where this fits in on curve, but obviously, if you can, attack with it and grab a Skyclave Apparition or a Brutal Cathar from your own graveyard or an Elite Spellbinder or something like that, and then when it dies, all these creatures just spring forth from it. And then your opponent is incentivized not to kill it in combat because, I can kill this thing that has one of my guys underneath it. But then if I kill it, they get back a Skyclave Apparition and a Brutal Cathar, and I lose 2 more of my guys. I don't want to do that math. So this thing is actually kind of interesting. And again, even if you don't want to steal, even if you don't want to put your own guys under it from your graveyard, it's probably going to be better used in most gameplay, like most real world applications. It's probably going to be better used as a removal spell. Fiend Hunter, a Brutal Cathar, Skyclave Apparition, one of those guys. And it's not terrible in that capacity, but 3 mana for a 1-powered dude is not the best thing in the world in most circumstances. So I'm not actually super sure that this creature is destined to do much. It doesn't do anything the turn it enters the battlefield. It's just got 2 toughness and it sits there like a grapefruit doing nothing for a whole turn. It doesn't actually block very well. It doesn't really attack very well either. Like, okay, next turn I'll attack with a 2-power guy. That's my 3-drop, a 2-power guy on the next turn. If it trains, it has to have other things around to make it good. There's ways to do it, there's plenty of 2 and 3-power creatures in Mono White. So it's not super hard to train it, but just the fact that okay, I've just been board wiped. My top deck is this. It doesn't do enough. I have problems with this card just a little bit, but I do think at the end of the day, especially if there's something cool enough to do with the ability to pseudo reanimate your own guys, then it might see some play here and there. But let's look at Gralnock the Omnivore next. A lot of people thought we might get the Gitrog monster back, and we didn't. We got a big old legendary frog, man. He's 4 mana, 2 in Simic colors for a 3/3 legendary frog. Whenever a frog you control attacks, you mill 3 cards. I just love that line of text. Whenever a permanent card is put into your graveyard from your library, exile it with a croak counter on it. There's the croak counters. You may play lands and cast spells from among cards you own in exile with croak counters on them. This is a good commander. If nothing else, it's a good commander. And historic, it goes pretty well with Karuga. That looks nice, doesn't it? I mean, if you're building Karuga, you're already going to be playing nothing but permanents for the most part. So yeah, but it's a fine card. I don't know how great it is in standard, especially since you have to have other frogs in play. But I guess you could have shapeshifters, right? You have changelings in play that are all creature types. And that might be okay, but I don't know how much I want to attack with my Maskwood Vandal in most games. So I don't know, but either way, this is a very cool card. Such a cool card. And even if it's the only frog you control, you do have to wait a turn for it to attack, and it doesn't have the best stats in the world, but at least you can effectively draw 3 cards so long as it survives that combat step. There's also a trick where you can swing in with it, mill the cards. If your opponent has a removal spell or a good block, you can bounce it back to your hand, cast it again, and the text still applies. The cards still have croak counters on them, so you can play it, right? If you exile 6 or 10 cards with this, 6 or 9 cards with this, your opponent kills it, and you play another one, you can now again play the cards with croak counters on them. So there are ways to get blown out, I guess, where you think you're going to be able to play the croak counters, and your opponent has the removal spell. That kind of sucks. The cards with croak counters on them, I mean to say. And that would suck to get blown out in that way. But again, if you draw into another one, you can then play those cards again. So no harm, no foul. Unless you lost the game in the interim, which is possible. So I don't know how powerful this card actually is, but I think this card is awesome. And sometimes that's all that matters. Now let's check out a Wrath effect that I really like. This is by invitation only. 5 mana, 3 and 2 white for a sorcery. Choose a number between 0 and 13. Each player sacrifices that many creatures. So a lot of you guys are getting on to me for having a one-sided board wipe in my Cards I Want video, but like, Wizards believes in one-sided board wipes too. It's effectively what this is in a lot of decks. This is fun because it's a board wipe that you could probably play in your aggro deck. It'd be kind of fine with it, you know? Like if the only way this sucks is if like your opponent has 17 creatures. Your opponent has 14 creatures. And that's just not going to happen very often. You know, if your opponent is way ahead of you in terms of bodies, just pick the highest number. Just, you have 9 guys, everybody sack 9 guys. So you could do that. Or if you're ahead of your opponent on board and you have like 6 dudes and they have 3 dudes, everybody sacrifice 3 creatures. Just keep your best 3 creatures and get in, son. So I actually think this card is very good. Like even in aggro deck, especially in aggro decks, you know, like, you curve out and you put like 8 dudes on the battlefield. Your opponent's dirtling with a troll and like 2 tokens. You know, like, everybody sack 4 guys. I win. It's so sick. And then like, even in control decks, this is still a board wipe. Like 9 times out of 10, this is a board wipe that doesn't affect you at all and kills the Innistrad Predators, you know, and the other indestructible guys. Like, it's just a really good card. Make no mistake, man. This gets around all kinds of nasty stuff that board wipes otherwise wouldn't be able to get around. I love that about it, but it can also, again, the one-sided aspect of it is very real, seriously. Like in a tokens deck. This is hot. You know, I have 10 guys on my side of the field. You have 5 dudes. Everybody sacrifice 5 guys. I'm still way ahead. It's pretty sexy. So I'm a big, huge fan of this card, and I want to break it in half. But now let's look at Dorothea, the Vengeful Victim. Where's Sophia and Blanchathea? Golden Girls. Sorry, stream people that were there on stream. I have to retell that joke. It's too precious to me. But anyway, Dorothy is 2 mana, a blue and a white for a 4/4 spirit with flying, and it's legendary. But here's the catch. When it attacks or blocks, sacrifice it at end of combat. But you can disturb it for 1, a white and a blue for Dorothy's Retribution. This is an aura that enchants a creature. The creature has, whenever this creature attacks, create a 4/4 white spirit creature token with flying that's tapped and attacking. Sack the token at end of combat. If Retribution would put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. I like the Geist of St. Trapped reference. Just go ahead and get that out of the way. That's cute. But this I actually really like. It's just 2 mana for 4 damage. I compared this to Boros Charm on stream, and I'm going to do it again here. I haven't yet decided that's a bad comparison. It's 2 mana for 4 flying damage most of the time in the very early game. But it can also just block and trade with Goldspan Dragons. So it's like kind of a removal spell against like very specific creatures that are important in this format. So I don't know. It blocks really well. It attacks really well, but it only gets to do those things once. But unlike most cards like this, it gets to do another thing, you know? Like when your opponent's low on cards, they've used up all the removal spells, and you have like a 2/2 left or something, and suddenly that 2/2 can make 4/4s and get in for 6 damage, you know? Like if you're on that kind of board state. It's just really interesting clock in the late game that I like a good bit. And again, being a creature on the one half does in some ways mitigate the disadvantage of being an aura, right? So I like a lot about this. I really do. I think it's really cool in like specifically the blue-white, like the Azorius tempo decks, because this gets in a good chunk of damage, or again, blocks if that's what you needed to do. But it gets in a good chunk of damage in the early game. And then later, when you stick the aura to something, you'll still have enough mana left to like negate or otherwise counterspell, you know, whatever spell the opponent tries to remove the creature this is attached to with. So there's a lot of cool like upside to this being in the color combination that it is. There's just a lot that I like about this. Now let's take a look at Big Ange coming up next. Everyone keeps telling me this card is Anje, and I'm sure that it is. I'm sure that you're right, but I really like saying Ange. So let's take a look at Big Ange here, Maid of Dishonor. 4 mana, 2, a black and a red for a 4/5 legendary vamp. Whenever Ange, Maid of Dishonor, and or 1 or more other vampires enter the battlefield under your control, create a blood token. This ability triggers only once each turn. You can pay 2 and sacrifice another creature or a blood token to have each opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life. So there's actually a lot of reasons to be stoked about this card. It doesn't actually look like much, I think, on first inspection, but for 4 mana, you get a 4/5, which isn't like, it could be better stats, let's be honest. It could be. Although we used to go nuts over 4 mana 5/5s, didn't we? But 4 mana 4/5 is passable stats, if nothing else. But this always gets you guaranteed value in the form of the blood token. If you play it on 6 mana and leave 2 up, well, then it can sacrifice the blood token or something else, it doesn't matter, to, deal 2 damage to the opponent the turn it comes into play, which is quite good. And if you untap with it on the battlefield, chances are, right, that you have 4 mana open and you can sacrifice stuff to at least deal 4 to your opponent that turn. That's a lot of reach in an aggro deck. This actually looks like a pretty decent 4-drop for vampires, especially again if it untaps with this card on the battlefield and it can get in for some damage during that combat step. Maybe if your opponent makes good blocks, then it can just, at instant speed, it doesn't say only do this as a sorcery. At instant speed, when your opponent blocks a creature, you can then sacrifice that creature, deal the 2 damage to your opponent, right? And then after combat, maybe sacrifice anything else to, finish off your opponent for the other 2 to 4 damage that you need. So again, a lot of reach in terms of the ability to close games in the vampire deck, which I think is really, really important. So this is also kind of an aristocrats kind of thing where it's 2 whole mana, which is a lot to sack a dude. But if you need a sack outlet, this is a very profitable sack outlet. So there's a lot about this card that I am super stoked to explore. So this might be one of the cards that I'm actually most excited about for the entire day, just because I think it might be standard playable in terms of what you get for the cost, the rate, and all that, the value that it leaves behind no matter what. But again, even if your opponent doesn't have the removal spell for it and you untap with it, I'm pretty sure you're going to win a lot of games with this card. But we got a brand new card. I was just about to get into the last few cards of the day, but we reloaded Mythic Spoiler and saw Volatile Arsonist. Now, I have not read this card yet. I'm reading it for the first time. This is 5 mana, 3 and 2 red for a 4/4 human werewolf with menace and haste. Oh boy. Whenever it attacks, it deals 1 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target player, and or up to 1 target planeswalker. And it has Daybound. Dire Strain Anarchist is the other side of it. It is a 5/5 menaced haste werewolf, and when it attacks, it deals 2 damage to each of up to 1 target creature, a player, and or a planeswalker. That's pretty sick. That's really not bad at all. I mean, 5 mana for a 4/4 menaced haste actually isn't great, but it's also not terrible. It's really not terrible. Haste is probably key on this. I guess the question is this better than Goldspan Dragon? And I think most of the time it will not be. But when Goldspan Dragon rotates out in the fall, maybe we'll see next fall. Then maybe we'll see about this. But while Goldspan's in the format, I highly doubt this is super playable. But I will say, it does have haste, it does have an evasive ability, and it does deal extra damage, which is something that Goldspan doesn't do. And if you can play it at night, it does even more haste damage than a Goldspan, and it's going to be able to shock a creature and, hit your opponent in the face for 2. So I don't know, man. That's actually pretty decent. But again, compared to Gary Oldman, I'm not sure that it's great. All right, before we get to the Sorins and the Olivias of the video, and they will be the last things we cover, I want to talk about a couple of cards that I think are actually really very quite good. And one of them, everyone seems to already know that, but the other is Voldaren Bloodcaster, which I haven't really seen too many people talk about, but I think this card is actually quite good. This is 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 2/1 vampire wizard with flying. When it or another non-token creature you control dies, you create a blood token. Whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more blood tokens, you can transform Bloodcaster into Bloodbat Summoner. That's awesome. This might be my new desktop my new, wallpaper on my computer. But yeah, this is a 3/3 flyer, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 black bat creature token with flying and has haste in addition to its other types. So this is actually really, really sweet. This is just 2 mana for a 2/1 flying with a relevant creature type and another relevant creature type. As a relevant species and a relevant class as well. Vampire, obviously, a 2 mana 2/1, 2 mana 2/1 flyer in the vampire deck is pretty decent for a few reasons. Triggering the pseudo spectacle ability on some of the vampires is one of those reasons. And this gets in a lot of damage in the early game, I imagine. But, it also just pretty much guarantees the creation of some value. Like if your opponent points a removal spell at it, it'll leave behind a blood token. But if any of your other guys die, you get blood tokens. In an Aristocrats deck, you're piling up blood tokens like crazy and stuff. And eventually, when you get the 5 tokens, for your 2 mana investment, you've gotten a 3/3 flyer that can create a bunch of 2/2s. I didn't even realize this till somebody pointed it out on stream, but like you don't lose the tokens after combat or anything. So like the first combat, when she attacks, you get a 2/2 flyer. The second combat, you get another 2/2 flyer in addition to the first one, and then another, and then another. And you have 5 blood tokens to transform this. So that's 5 turns worth of bats to work with. So like, I actually think this is really, really sweet. It's a 2-drop that, you know, gets bigger, has an evasive ability, creates more value in the form of tokens, bodies that can be left behind after it dies. Even if it dies before it transforms, it'll leave behind some value. So like, this card is actually, I think, very, very standard playable. And don't discount the fact that it's a wizard. I've already talked about it has 2 relevant, you know, creature types, but wizard is important for these party decks, and it's possible, you know, blue-black party perhaps with this card, little concerted defense action, like this definitely opens up some doors to some interesting party mechanics. So Vampire Party was kind of already a sort of a thing if you wanted to make it one. And this really helps push it over the edge. You know, it pays off your creatures for dying, which is something you want in a party deck. It makes you feel a little bit better about your dudes dying. It's just this good card, guys. I really think that this is a very good Magic card and no one's paying attention to it. But we'll next look at a card that a lot of people are calling the best card of the day in terms of standard playability. And that's actually slightly hard to argue with. This is Overcharged Amalgam. 4 mana, 2 and 2 blue for a 3/3 zombie horror with flash and flying, and exploit. When Overcharged Amalgam exploits a creature, counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. So this is a very good creature. Make no mistake, guys. This is a very, very good creature. Like, it can just be a 4 mana, 3/3 flying flash. Like, I think you'll actually play it in that mode occasionally in standard, but mostly you want to counterspell, and there's plenty of decks. You know, there's the decayed zombie decks that have creatures laying around, there's tokens decks, there's pest decks, there's the Master of Puppets deck, there's, you know, just the eye twitch, shambling ghast, you know, gooble gobble, those decks. You know, there's plenty of creatures to go around and sacrifice in your blue decks nowadays. And there's even some other flash creatures, like in Rogues. You know, in Rogues you can flash creatures in and still play at instant speed, and then just sacrifice. Just get rid of one of your dudes or something. Get rid of your 2-drop or whatever that you flashed in and sacrifice it to this, counter a spell. It seems like such a blowout. Oh, it seems like such a ridiculous blowout, dude. And like, obviously it doesn't even have to counter a spell. It can counter abilities too. It's just, this is a really, really sick Magic card, and you need to pay attention to it. And I shouldn't have to tell you that because everybody already is. Like I said, a lot of people are calling this the best card of the day for standard playability, and that is difficult to say anything against because this is just a stacked Magic card. It's a good one. By the way, just because I'm calling it a good card doesn't mean that like I love it. I'm sure I'll play with this card because if you can't beat them, join them. But this is going to be a really irritating card to just exist in the first place. It's going to be one you're going to have to be looking out for every time your opponent has 4 open mana. Trust me. It's like, do I want to cast something? I guess I don't, because if I cast something, they're going to cast that stupid thing and counter it and get a 3/3, and then I'm done. So I guess I'm not. I'm just going to pass turn and let them spend their mana on their turn. Memory deluge, EOT. It's going to happen. It's going to happen all the time. So get ready for that. But now, let's look at Olivia, the Crimson Bride, ladies and gentlemen. This is 6 mana, which you may have clocked is a lot of mana. This is 4, a black and a red for a 3/4 Vampire Noble with flying and haste. Whenever Olivia Crimson Bride attacks, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains when you don't control a legendary vampire. Exile this creature. All right, so my favorite play that chat came up with like all day, because I didn't see this at first, is just Drana. You get the Drana out of your graveyard when you attack with this. And it's a legendary vampire, so you'll get to keep it forever, and that's cute. And then the Drana can bring more stuff back, and it's cute. It's cute. And I think that play is really awesome, but I think that this is like simultaneously the best reanimation target and the best reanimation spell in standard, like starting now. One of the worst things about this, though, is that it can't attack past a Goldspan Dragon or an Ashmouth Dragon or multiple other flyers in the format that are like relatively heavily played. But I guess the good part about that is that usually your opponent has attacked with their Goldspan Dragon. Right? So you don't have to worry too much about getting through it. It's already tapped. But still, once your opponent knows about this, they're not going to let you get too many more cards with it. But it gets a card immediately when it comes down. And if your opponent's tapped out, there's not a whole heck of a lot they can do about that. But your opponent does have a window, because you reanimate it with like a reanimation spell, or you cast it, and you put it on the table. Then you have to move to combat, and they just Fading Hope it, and they laugh at you. Fading Hope your 6-drop, they blow you out, they Elrond's Epiphany, they win. So I don't know how much I love the card. I really want to, because I love reanimation. I've wanted a good reanimation target in Standard for a while now. And again, against tapped out opponents or opponents that don't have access to cards like Fading Hope or Divide by Zero. I think this card is probably going to be pretty decent. A decent way to win games. Good finisher and all that. I think that it's probably interesting with stuff like Velomachus Lorehold, although I think you miss the attacking trigger on Velomachus if you do that, but you get to do it on subsequent turns. But there's probably all kinds of like fun stuff, get back a Blade Historian and swing Double Strike with both guys. Like there's probably some really cool stuff to do with this and some easy reanimation spells to make use of. So I want to brew with this card, but at the end of the day, I wish I could expect more from it. But now let's look at Sorin, ladies and gentlemen. It looks like he's on his phone in this picture for some reason. He's also doing the thing where you wear a jacket, but you don't put your sleeves in it or your arms in it. I've never understood that look. But anyway, Sorin the Mirthless is 4 mana, 2 and 2 black for a 4 loyalty planeswalker. You can +1 it to Dark Confidant. If you look at the top card of your library, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. You can -2 Sorin to create a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink. Not quite Nighthawk Scavenger, because it doesn't have the death touch, but still pretty good. And then -7 to have Mirthless deal 13 damage to any target, and you gain 13 life. So if it doesn't end the game right then and there, you'll put you right back in it. Card is awesome. Like this could see play as like a 4-drop in Vampire's deck at the top of the curve, because you're not going to rip too much off the top of your library that hurts you that badly. It might deal like 3 damage to you, or maybe you draw another Sorin and you take 4, which probably sucks in some situations, but you're probably okay with it in your aggro deck, like a lot of the time. It is a May ability though, so you can just +1 Sorin, elect to not reveal the card and not take any damage, but then kind of feel bad because all you really accomplished was a +1, and that's could be worse, but it could be way better too. But just as like a piece of mono black card draw, I do like the card. I wish it went a little bit better in like Blood on the Snow decks, but it's probably still going to be in Blood on the Snow decks. It's a pretty good 4-mana walker to get back with a Blood on the Snow. So I expect it to still be around, but it is going to kind of suck to like see Blood on the Snow on top of your library when you +1 this. But if, like I said on stream earlier, man, if you're at like 7 and your opponent's going to kill you next turn, you'll take the 6 to draw the Blood on the Snow and cast it. So could be worth it in some situations, right? And the fact that it makes lifelink duders kind of helps mitigate the fact that you lose life on the +1. So I like that. And if you get to the ultimate, it kind of reminds me of Professor Onyx's ultimate. Like it probably ends the game. It probably does. So, like really good punch on the ultimate to close games out. Pretty sweet creature factory ability. I think that's probably the best thing about the card, all things considered. If you play this and -2 it and then plus it and then -2 it and then plus it, that's a really good like sequence of turns, Or if you play it and then plus it and then minus it and then plus it and minus it. Or minus it 2 turns in a row. There's so many, see how many like sequences there are that with this card that seem halfway decent. But I think most of the time you're going to play it, -2 it, get a thing to block for it, gain you a little bit of life. It's just the 2/3 flying lifelink guy is good. That's pretty good, especially when you play this on 4, your opponent untaps, plays a land, and plays Goldspan Dragon. Well, now you have a blocker for it. So, I think there's a lot of cool ways this like lines up with the format, a lot of cool decks for it to go into. So, end of the day, it's almost certainly going to see some play here or there in the first couple of weeks, but we'll see if it hangs on past that. That's what I'm interested to see. That is all the spoilers for today. We made it. I don't know how long this took, but thanks for hanging in there for the entire thing and getting to see the best cards and all that. But it is spoiler season now, everybody, so get ready. There's going to be about a week and a half or 2 weeks of this. So sub to the channel if you haven't done it yet to make sure you get the content every day. Hit the bells for the notifications. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Share it to where more people get the spoiler action and all that stuff. And then, of course, go down there in the sideboard, the old comments section, and let me know how you felt about it. Any interactions I missed or screwed up, because I tend to do that on occasion. So if I did do something, at least it will increase engagement and thus help me in the algorithm. But if I did screw up, let me know. Either way, just let me know how you felt about all these cards today, interactions that I missed, stuff you're excited to do with them, all that stuff. This is a fun time to be in the comments section. But aside from that, do all this stuff, we get on the Twitch. I'll be back on this weekend talking about the spoilers that we've seen so far in the first few days of spoiler season. Probably don't want to miss that either. It's always fun to hang out with you guys and talk like face to face. So have fun with that, and check out the Patreon too if you enjoy my content. Help support it for $1 a month. Helps tremendously. You have no idea how much $1 helps. And be able to vote, you will be able to vote on the decks that we do during Crimson Vow season if you just pitch in $1 a month. So help me out there, and then follow me on Twitter for takes. But aside from that, I got to get out of here. I got to edit this video and get it online before it's like midnight. So love you guys. Just let me know how you felt about it, and I'll catch you cats later. I am Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.